观察者网的观众朋友们，大家好啊！欢迎来收看今天的直播啊！大家都知道呢，特朗普马上就要走马上任了，这宣布着特朗普2.0时代即将会到来。那么，关于全球秩序将来会走向何方，外交政策呢又是否会产生一些改变？中美之间的关系要如何去推进，以及未来在美国优先的指导政策之下呢，美国会再一次变得真正伟大吗？今天呢，我们非常有幸请到了上海外国语大学的杰出教授黄靖老师这也是我们的老朋友了，以及美国经济学家大卫戈德曼。今天呢，在直播中跟大家一起谈一谈，前瞻一下关于特朗普上任之后可能会有哪些变化。现在呢，我们将镜头交给黄老师。
Before that, may I just ask you a very simple question? What's your view, overall view of Donald Trump? I mean, to the world.
Well, I think Trump is a big positive relative to the previous administration.
You think so?
Yeah, absolutely. America First is also an America that focuses on its own problems as opposed to trying to remake the world in its own image. I think that the great, in fact, catastrophic mistake that the United States made after the fall of communism in Russia in 1990 was to imagine that history had come to an end and the world would now revert to a liberal democracy of the American model. And all we had to do was conduct a few military expeditions and a few color revolutions in order to nudge it in that direction. As Marco Rubio said yesterday in his confirmation hearings, this was a delusion. And I think the fact that Trump and his team, for example, Senator Rubio, understand that it was a delusion is an enormous change for the better. Now, working out what America's role should be in a world in which we don't write the rules, which is not the end of history, a multipolar world, is a difficult issue for us, and it will take us quite some time to adjust to a different world and understand what our role should be. So I expect a lot of trial and error, a lot of improvisation, and any number of errors, but I don't expect errors on the scale of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, or indeed the Ukraine War. Trump has said in public several times that the expansion of NATO provoked the Ukraine War. In other words, he has attributed at least some of the blame for the Ukraine war to the Western side and not exclusively to the Russian side. That's a breakthrough because if we're going to have peace, we have to understand that everyone has responsibility for the problems and responsibility for the solutions, and there has to be compromise. That's very different from Biden, who believed that the Ukraine war would lead to regime change in Russia and said so publicly.
Yes, I still remember that's March 26, 2022. He said in Poland, he said this man has to go and he cannot stay in power.
Yes, and in fact, the whole of the American foreign policy establishment publicly and privately believed that the Ukraine war would lead to the end of Putin's regime in Russia. And of course,
which is a delusion. Of course, it did not come true.
Right. So
and I agree. And I think that one of the problem, I think, started from Clinton administration. They believe they can Americanize the world. The so-called globalization for Clinton's people is this. I know them well, and is that they not only have a globalization of market economy, but also have globalization of value, the so-called universal value, and also globalization of democracy. Huntington Jobs' book for the three waves of democratization. All three globalization, especially the globalization of value and the democracy failed miserably. That's why they have color revolution, Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. But only one globalization which have some success in terms of which perspective you're talking about. I mean, the globalization of economy. But exactly on this part, that's really that Donald Trump want to undo. I think not another issue. But right now, there are some scholars and which I, to a certain degree, agree with, is that Donald Trump wants to return to Jacksonism. That is American first, started from President Jackson in 19th century, and we know that after World War II, the mainstream in U.S. foreign policy is a Wilsonism, which means that the United States, as a state in this big island called America, we have to establish a U.S.-led alliance system to support the so-called U.S. leadership or U.S. hegemony. And actually, globalization, as a globalism, is based on this Wilsonism, but now it's a total reaction against that. But having said this, there are people who argue that if United States quit from the so-called globalism or from Wilsonism, go back to Jacksonism, it's called New Jacksonism, then what about the so-called international order? Especially what about a transatlantic bridge? I was in Europe a few months ago. They were kind of like end of the history, indeed end of history, end of day, that the transatlantic bridge will be damaged or even collapse under Trump
Well,
administration.
it really depends
So
what we
what's the
do.
impact of that?
Remember, uh, I forget which British diplomat said that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the
Out, yeah.
Germans down. Uh, the United States has to come to the conclusion that we are better off with partners instead of puppets. And the Ukraine war uh, put us in a position where we used all of our resources to arm twist European politicians into supporting a policy which was against Europe's interest. The lack of access to Russian gas is destroying German manufacturing. The energy intensive side of German manufacturing has shrunk by 20%
Oh,
in the
yeah.
past 3 years. And it would mean the end of Germany as a manufacturing power. So what I hope will happen is that as the patriotic parties, the Trump-like parties in Europe come to the fore, as we've already seen in a number of countries, for example, in
Yeah.
Austria, and of course
And
in
Germany,
Hungary.
also France, maybe.
Yes, that we'll see a different kind of transatlantic partnership where there will be more independence of action on the part of the Europeans, but we'll still be good friends and we'll do a lot of things together.
Yeah, but
But
is
I,
this, yeah,
so take
sorry,
for
go ahead.
example, the AfD in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany. Uh, I know a number of leaders of the AfD. I've interviewed them in Asia Times, where I'm deputy editor. Uh, the AfD is the only party in Germany which wants to reintroduce military conscription. Germany in the 1980s had a very powerful army.
Also reconciliate with Russia
Well,
and also very anti-immigration.
they
I think,
want,
I,
yes,
I, for my job, I have to be in Berlin 2 or 3 months every year. I have quite a few friends there. They were so scared at the very beginning about AfD, the things that right wing, so on and so forth. But it's a surprise. I mean, just I'm talking reality, not politics. I mean, in the past few months, AfD just come from nowhere last year. Rise from about less than one digital percentage to right now is 22%. And the leader, this woman, her supporting rate is increased. I think it's 26% among all the
yes,
individual leaders. It's
yes, she
amazing.
is.
I think
But
the momentum
she
is
is.
there already.
Yes, she has the highest personal rating. It will take a long time for the AfD to come to power. It will not happen
No,
after
maybe they
the
could be in the
elections.
government. But let's go back to this NATO enlargement. I agree with you that, the sometime, especially during Yeltsin and the first time Putin, Russia did seriously, sincerely want to join Europe. And we also have politicians in Germany and in France who want to tame Russia, get Russia in. But of course, round after NATO enlargement, in my view, of course, led by United States, is a one stone for three birds. Number one, to limit, continuously to contain Russia, make Russia a weak player, so weak it would not directly challenge or threat American security. Number two, this kind of enlargement will provoke Russia's resistance, which it happened. And when Russia resists and Europe will feel threatened, when Europe feels threatened, it will have to stay together or stay under Uncle Sam for
Well,
security.
exactly.
So
I think that's right. I
in
agree
that
with you.
reason, Americans are quite successful to provoke the war. Let me tell you a story which I know is that when Germany was trying to reunify, all the major powers were against it, except Russia or Soviet Union. So Kohl, in order to pursue Americans to support him, he went to Washington, D.C. I was in Washington, D.C. at that time. He met with George W. Bush. He met with Jim Baker. And eventually he was successful. And George W. Bush said, look, we support you for reunification, but only with one condition that Jim Baker told him. You read his memo. He said, this condition is Germany will have to perpetually stay in NATO. And Kohl was a little bit surprised. He said, if Warsaw Pact dissolved, we have no need for NATO, which means United States want NATO as a handle to hold Europe, to make Europe rely upon U.S. for security. And after that, we'll see that after 4 or 5 rounds. Another story I know is that I talked to Putin in 2013 at the dinner party. I said, what's a turning point of relationship between Russia and Europe? And he said, the 2008. You know what happened in 2008? We all know that number one, United States deployed the missile defense system to Poland and the Czech, which of course is up to the nose for Russia. Second, that was the year
Yes.
when Georgia and Ukraine officially applied for membership of NATO. That's why in August, Putin launched the Georgia war. I think that's a turning point. No return. I also asked the former secretary of NATO, this Spanish guy, I forgot, Sununus, and he said, on this part, I agree with Putin. 2008 was a turning point. No, I just echo your point. Here is that the war in Ukraine actually started in 2014 after the Maidan Plaza Revolution and Crimea. And after that, of course, 2022 was a breakthrough point. But having said this, my question is that, do you think that Donald Trump really can end this war in his term the way he wants, or there might be some other issues have to consider? After
I
all,
think
he said
I think
24 hours I can end the war, but now it's 6 months.
the short-term answer is no,
Okay.
because Trump wants to look strong, and unfortunately, the Western position in Ukraine is weak. So there are ways to end it. Um, I mean, think of Vietnam. You might need a sudden and unexpected change in leadership in Ukraine, for example. Um,
I know what you mean. I got
yes,
it. I know. Yeah, yeah.
right. There are ways to manage this. The difficulty is that Trump does not want to look weak, and he doesn't want to open himself to criticism that he's the person who lost Ukraine. The press has consistently lied about about the course of the Ukraine war and presented a much more optimistic picture. Uh, so something will have to break uh, for a peace agreement to come into effect, and I think it will take it could take 6 months or much longer, depending on what Trump does. Trump
Yeah, I think
certainly wants to end the
internally
war.
Trump may also have some resistance. For example, he just say drill, baby, drill, and those energy industry may not like Ukraine war to end too early because that means Russia's energy will
Uh,
go to the world, which is not a
the
good news.
uh, I don't believe that that will be the major consideration. The major consideration will be how the United States gets out of this without looking weak.
No, I think that if I think Donald Trump want to make himself looking strong, a man who can get things done, and United States will not be looking weak if they can strike a good term with Russia. I think the major problem is that internal resistance and also Europe. And the problem of Europe is that Europe is so fragmented and they simply cannot make a clear-cut decision. When I was in Europe, and quite a few Germans and French friends came to me and said, "Look, China should mediate a peace." I said, "Look, Chinese do want to work with Europeans on this, but Europe as a whole has a very strong attitude, but no clear-cut position. They have a lot of preferences, a lot of demands, but no clearly defined policy. They were driven
Yes,
by the situation.
there's
So
a
it's
lot
very
of
difficult working with them."
I agree. There's a great deal of talk about China playing a role in Ukrainian negotiations. I think that's exaggerated because
No.
it's not
Yeah.
China's issue.
No. China does want to play certain role in that in terms to protect China's interests. And also, President Xi Jinping named a special envoy, a very experienced diplomat Li Hui, to do it. But after all, this Europeans' issue is your affair. I mean, Europeans' affairs. If Europeans could not figure out what exactly they want, nobody can help them. On the other hand, I agree with your point you just made, is that Europe as a whole is the biggest loser in this, especially Germans. I don't know. That's why I talk openly to my German friends. I say, I don't understand you guys. You're burning down your own house.
Look,
In that regard, AfD maybe is a good answer.
the whole German political establishment is acts more like representatives of the American imperial power than like German politicians. And you really need a political change to transform that. It doesn't necessarily have to be the AfD. There are elements of the SPD that are relatively independent, and then you've got, for example, the CSU, Markus Söder in Bavaria.
uh, President Donald Trump is coming back to White House in next 5 days, 4 or 5 days. So he has a fundamental change. We can expect a fundamental change of U.S. policy, both internally and externally. So the first question, of course, is that what kind of impact Donald Trump's administration will bring to our world, especially even before he entered the White House, he already put a very open, seems quite bizarre demand on Greenland and Canada and so on and so forth. So what does this mean to the world?
Well, I would leave the Greenland issue aside. It's a pure historical accident that Denmark owns Greenland. Uh, Denmark has done very little with Greenland, which has a population of 45,000. And
Yes.
the transfer of Greenland to the United States, I believe, would not have a fundamental effect on global strategy or foreign policy. It's not something I'm worried about. The basic problem Trump faces is the same that any American president would face. The United States now has a negative net international investment position of $24 trillion. That is, over the last 30 years, we've
Yep.
had a cumulative trade deficit of about $24 trillion, and we have paid for the excess of what we buy over what we sell by selling our assets
Mhm.
to the rest of the world. In the last 10 years, that's mainly been stocks. We've financed our trade deficit on our tech stock boom. This is not a sustainable situation. There's a famous saying from the economist Arthur Oken, anything that can't go on forever won't. So Trump's emphasis on restoring American manufacturing, correcting the trade deficit, is very strong, but any American president would have to confront this. So Trump is trying to do something about this, and that means a different role in the world for the United States and a different kind of American economy. I think there are many things that have to change for Trump to be successful. Trump has
Yep.
emphasized tariffs. Tariffs alone, I do not think will be adequate to accomplish what he wants. There are other things that have to be done. But we've come to an historical turning point where the United States simply can't play the role in the world economy that it has for the past 30 years.
Yeah, but United States has been, yeah, I agree with you that we have start to turn the situation around. No country, especially United States, can suffer such a large trade deficit with such piling debt, $36 trillion. Just think about interest. But we know that United States as a hegemon ever since okay, 1991, or you can argue since 1945. But this kind of hegemony is actually based on a kind of alliance system led by United States. That's a foundation, especially the so-called transatlantic bridge that the U.S.-Europe alliance not only support United States to win the Cold War, but also has drive the so-called Wilsonism to such a height. United States have this policy or strategy called globalism, want to Americanize the entire world, started from Clinton administration. But now Donald Trump doesn't want all of this, especially the transatlantic bridge. He began to even want to withdraw from NATO. So if that's the case, then what's next? Because we do know the transatlantic bridge is not only the foundation for U.S. hegemony in the past 4 decades, but also is a foundation for the so-called liberal international order. If this is gone, what kind of world we're going to see?
Well, I think that America's alliances in Asia with Japan, South Korea, and Australia are also extremely important, equally important to the alliance with Europe. But a lot of the damage to American influence in the past 2 decades is self-inflicted. We had a vision that history had come to an end and that the world
Yeah,
would adopt a
Fukuyama's
liberal
words.
democratic
Yes.
order after the fall of the Soviet Union. Marco Rubio, at his confirmation hearings yesterday, described this as a delusion. And I think this change in attitude on the part of the Trump administration is fundamental and is of great importance. Uh, Take Rubio, for example. In September, Rubio published a 60-page report on China's economy entitled The World China Made. And Rubio is a very strong critic of China. He's certainly not a friend of China, but the report says China has essentially accomplished everything that it set out to do.
Yep.
It had an ambitious policy of technological transformation, and it has executed that policy successfully. And it's established its supply chains around the world in a very impressive way. So I think Rubio's acknowledgement of China's success, despite his very strong criticisms of China, is an extremely important development. Because one of the corollaries of our delusion about American superiority is that no other system could succeed. But if we admit that China has accomplished what it set out to do since Xi Jinping came into power in 2012 with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the Made in China 2025 initiative, we have to realize that China is there to stay, and we have to live in the same world and find a way to do that without killing each other.
Yeah, we are going to come back to U.S.-China relations later on, but now I want to stay still on this United States and the global order. We know that what really get United States and Europe together recently is this Ukraine war. Now President Donald Trump said, first he said, I'm going to end it in 24 hours, but now it's 6 months and so forth, so on and so forth. But I understand that we have different explanations or narratives about how war started. On the one side, said, okay, it's pure Russia invasion, aggression. But my view is that I think the war started long before 2022. I think you agree with me. It started in 2014 in Maidan Plaza revolution, so on and so forth. The essential cause, of course, is this continuous enlargement of NATO. But putting this aside, do you think President Donald Trump really can end this war the way he wants, or we have some problems?
Well, I think there are real difficulties in ending the war, but it's extremely important that Trump, on several public occasions, has said that the expansion of NATO led to the war. In other
Yeah.
words, he does not blame Putin one-sidedly for the war. He
Yeah.
says that there is responsibility for the war on the part of the United States and its allies. So recognizing that there's responsibility on both sides is a precondition to a peace that both sides can find acceptable. Now, the obvious difficulty, and I'm not saying, what I'm saying is, I think what everybody knows is that Russia now has the military advantage in the war. The United States does not want to appear weak. It does not want to appear that Putin is dictating terms. I believe the main issue which the Russians will demand is Ukrainian neutrality,
Yep.
that Ukraine will not enter NATO. For the United States to accept this demand at this point would be viewed as a major indication of weakness. Trump doesn't want to appear weak. So I don't think that there is going to be a solution in the next few months. What I think is most likely is that the Russian military advantage will gradually increase and that something will break inside the Ukrainian government. Zelensky will leave, some general will overthrow him, there will be elections, he'll be voted out of office. Something will change on the Ukrainian side. And only then will the United States be able to uh, find a peace formula with Russia. I think Trump very
But
much wants it. He doesn't want the Ukraine war. He's certainly concerned about the possibility of escalation, which is a real and dangerous possibility. But on the other hand, Trump cannot bring himself as an American president to look like the Russians are dictating the terms.
yeah, the saying that Putin wants basically two things. Number one, Ukraine cannot enter NATO, you just said. And number two, whatever Russia got from Ukraine, the west, east of the river, they'll keep it, right? I think the first demand to Putin, from Putin's point of view, is not negotiable. That's the fundamental goal for his, for Georgian get into this war. And second, of course, maybe negotiable, quote and unquote. But I agree with you that this war is not sustainable at all without support of United States and European countries. Ukraine simply cannot continue this war. So the issue here is that question that if, like you said, we want something happen inside Ukraine, or maybe change of regime change or change of leadership, which is very likely. Because if we look at the Korean War, Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, we turn from the fighting period into negotiation period. When this turn, always leadership change, right? You remember Yi Cheng-mian, you remember Yun in Vietnam. But here they say that does Donald Trump want to quietly or whatever to cut or even stop the support to Ukraine, so make Ukrainians realize they cannot fight this war anymore. So therefore, they change leadership. Do you think that's the way what you meant?
This is certainly a possibility. So, for example, when the designee for National Security Advisor,
Yeah.
Michael Waltz,
Wash, yes.
called for Ukraine to reduce the conscription age to 18, this is double-edged because
No,
it
he's
could
against
be,
it, right? Yeah.
well, Zelensky's against it. It would be
Yeah.
politically disastrous for him to attempt it inside
Yeah.
Ukraine. It may be that the United States will make a demand on Zelensky that he cannot comply with, namely lowering the conscription age, and that could be a pretext for
Mhm.
reducing military aid. But I'm purely speculating. At this point, I do not believe that Trump's national security team has a clear game plan. I think it's worth stepping back and looking at the fundamental imbalance. A weak Europe facing a strong Russia always depended on the American nuclear umbrella. And that was the source of the risk of nuclear war, because if Europe can't defend itself, and the only way to defend it is for America to come in and threaten the use of nuclear weapons,
Yeah, yeah.
then the possibility of nuclear escalation is very high. That's exactly what happened in 1983.
There will be another possibility. If something happen in Europe, for example, we know that the right wing is gaining momentum in both Germany, France, and so on and so forth. If that happened, if something happened in Europe, gave a kind of opportunity to end the war from Europeans' initiative, do you think that that's a possibility?
Let me finish the thought. Helmut Kohl in the 1980s built the German army into a formidable force,
Yeah.
12 divisions, 3,000 battle tanks, and that
Mm-hmm.
stabilized the European situation, because if
Mm-hmm.
Germany can defend itself conventionally, then you
Yeah.
don't need American nuclear weapons. And that's exactly what should happen now. The European countries should be able to defend themselves without American help, and that would create a balance
Conventionally.
of power in Europe that would make
Yeah.
things stable. And there's only one party in Germany which proposes that as a practical solution. That's the alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland. They
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
reintroduce conscription. So I think what Trump should do is to cultivate, work with the European patriotic parties, the populists, to create a new kind of NATO where Europe is capable of defending itself, and the threat, which I think is exaggerated, of Russia invading Europe goes away. And that would eliminate the nuclear threat and the need for Ukraine to be in NATO. But that will take
But
time.
yeah, but talk about alternative parties are gaining momentum. Also, Le Monde is gaining momentum in France, and the right wing already won in Austria. So all of them have one thing in common. That is, they want reconciliate with Russia. They said we have to improve our relationship with Russia. So if that's the case, if that happened, do you think it's easier for Donald Trump to end the war, and because Europe is coming to the same page? Do you think we can, instead of have some internal change in Ukraine, it's Europeans who said enough is enough. We don't fight anymore. This war is doing us no good at all. If that's a situation, I don't know, because all the major European powers are facing major elections within 6 months.
Well, I strongly agree that the European right-wing parties, what I call the patriotic parties, represent a solution. Long term, Europe is going to have to live with Russia, which means it will have to have economic relations with Russia. This long term military standoff with Russia is destructive for everybody. So it's in everyone's interest, including the United States, to stabilize that. Uh, if the Europeans can defend themselves without the American nuclear umbrella, they will accomplish what Donald Trump wants. He doesn't want America to pay for European defense. He wants the Europeans to pay for their own defense. And that's exactly the arrangement
Yeah,
we should.
David, we have to move on. And I think we all agree that there's still a lot of problems ahead of us to end this very tragic war. But we do see some light at the end of tunnel. Let's move to another issue, which is Israel-Palestinian conflict, which, of course, Donald Trump also said he want bring peace. Given what's happening in Syria just in the past months, do you think he has a solution to this another very tragic event, especially what we see what's happening in Gaza and so on and so forth, and because the situation there could be more complicated and more challenging?
American policy in the Middle East is very confused. For example, the Biden administration made Qatar a major non-NATO ally of the United States in January of 2022. Qatar was the major financier of Hamas, and the latest
Yeah.
crisis in the Middle East began, as we all know, on October 7th of 2023, when Hamas launched an attack um, on Israel, which killed more Jews than on any day since the
Yeah, and
Holocaust.
also hold a lot of hostages, civilians.
Yes, so Hamas created atrocities, and Qatar um, continued to host Hamas in Doha. It imposed no penalties in Hamas. I think Qatar is something of a rogue element in this. And I also believe that the Syrian coup by the
Hmm.
HTS guerrilla group involved Qatar and the same sort of Muslim Brotherhood radical Sunni elements which were active during the Syrian civil war. So I think the United States has to clean out some of the debris left from the Biden administration and have a clear policy. Um, Turkey needs to be brought into the security architecture. That means the United States has to have an agreement with Turkey about the status of the Kurds in Syria. Uh, our support for the Kurdish militias in the Northeast has been, let's say, an existential risk to Turkey, and we have to have a clear policy as to what we're doing. We have to have uh, a clear view of cleaning out radicalism. So, and we have to find a way to uh, convince Iran that it should try to develop itself as a nation state instead of being the core of a new Shiite empire. I
No,
think
that
Iran
empire
has
is
that.
collapsing after Syria. It's
Yes, Iran has not done terribly well.
yeah.
We also have to acknowledge that China is going to have a more important role in the Middle East because the Belt and Road Initiative is a very important factor long term.
But China did, I think, achieved quite substantially. China mediate the reconciliation between Saudis and Iran, which is, in my view, historical achievement. And also, China just a few months ago mediate a kind of negotiation between the factions, or 14 of them, in Beijing. And of a Palestinian issue, and China is also trying to embrace the Gulf countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. But the situation here seems to be more complicated. I agree with you. The Biden administration's policy towards the Middle East is very confusing, either in Syria or Israel and so on and so forth. But the fundamental question is that to what extent the Donald Trump administration can bring peace to that region, can stop the tragedy in Gaza, can also handle this mess in Syria. And as I understand, it looks like the three-dimensional. It looks from what President Donald Trump said. Number one, to continue this extreme pressure on Iran. Number two, to give Netanyahu government full support. And number three, try to bring the Saudis back to the table. And last but not the least, to give Turkey a kind of role to play. But putting all this together, we see some holes in it. I don't, for example, to what extent the American government will continue to support Netanyahu's extreme policy in the region.
Uh, as you know, yesterday, Hamas and Israel agreed to a ceasefire for the
Yeah.
first time in the course of this war, which was pretty much imposed by the incoming Trump administration. I don't believe the Israelis would have agreed to that without Trump demanding it. So
Under the table, yes.
that's so it is not at all clear to me how the Trump team is going to approach the Middle East. I think you've got many different voices in there at this point. and I simply don't know enough about the thinking. Uh, One area which I think the United States has neglected, which is critical, is Central Asia. China has been extremely active, as you know, in Central Asia in building infrastructure, and its partnership with Turkey has increased. Its partnership with the Gulf states has increased. This is critical because Central Asia is a growing population. Its labor force will double this century. Iran and Turkey are shrinking. So my concern as an American is that the United States has basically left this uh, to China to develop. I believe that the United States and its allies should be very proactive in the development of Central Asia and offer some competition to China. I'm not
How?
complaining about what China is doing. I'm complaining that we're not doing it.
How and by what means that Americans can return to Central Asia, which is a very important, I agree with you, strategically very important area. It's a bridge between Europe and Asia. And China is gaining momentum there by Belt and Road Initiative. All the 5 countries in the region joining in this 5+1 agreement, which is a historical breakthrough.
I, I think it's very clear that the government of Kazakhstan, which is by far the most important economy in Central Asia, as well as
Yep.
Uzbekistan, would welcome a diversity of international relationships and a diversity of economic relationships. So I would hope that if we can resolve the Ukraine war, that Germany can go back to its historic roots and play a major role in the development of Central Asia. And I think Japan and South Korea would be interested as well. I think the United States should be developing a consortium with its friends.
But again, we're going back to U.S. allies. So we just said Donald Trump doesn't want these allies. So Donald Trump want this bring us to another issue about the high tariff. This high tariff to me is almost indiscriminational. I mean, to everyone he wants high tariffs. What is high tariff we bring to the world? Do you think it will work? We bring the U.S. back economically and also in terms of the manufacture?
The way I look at it is the United States consumer has provided a very large share of the world's demand for industrial goods for the past
Mhm.
30 years. That has to stop because we can't keep borrowing overseas to finance a trade deficit. So countries will have to find other markets, and the big market is the global South. Central Asia is an example of that. That's exactly what China has done. China has shifted its export profile slowly away from the United States to the global South. That's a good policy. China has done a good job. We should be doing the same thing. We should be competing with China and competing with Belt and Road and developing our markets in the global.
But China's approach is open up. Yeah, it's try to promote this globalization and the economic integration. But Donald Trump is doing the other way around. He wants high tariff, want close the door. And so if you levy high tariffs to all your trade partners, how can you redevelop the market that in your favor?
Because the markets of the future are not more exports to the United States, they're more exports to the 7 billion people of the global South. I've been writing, as you know, about China's outreach to the global South with the Belt and Road Initiative and related programs for 10 years. My objection is not that China is doing this. My objection is we are not doing this. So we should work with our partners to reorient export markets to where there is room for expansion, namely the global
But
South.
David, let me sorry to interrupt you here. It puzzles me. The policy seems like you don't sell to us. You sell us to too much. We buy too much to borrow your money. So we have a tariff so that you can now dump your stuff into our market, but buy Americans. But the problem is that if you levy high tariff to others, others might very likely retaliate to have also the high tariff on you. So therefore, how can you open up their market? Because you close your market, others can do the same. So this looks there's something there that does not work out.
Well, there's a question of where tariffs will be imposed. For example, the United States imports a great deal from the global south. As you know, as
Yeah,
our imports from China have fallen, our imports from other countries in the global south have risen, and some of this
yeah.
reflects indirect Chinese exports to the United States. So we will have to be very judicious about tariffs. Take our relations with Brazil and Indonesia and India. These are countries which have enormous markets. Between Brazil, Indonesia, and India, we're talking about 1.8 billion people.
Let me repeat this point is that it's by design the structure because United States keeps exporting U.S. dollars and everybody uses U.S. dollars to to sell to Americans, and then the money they made cannot buy anything from the United States but your treasury bond and real estate. So United States using a paper, a U.S. dollars to suck in all the manufactured goods of the entire world, manufacture offshore, profit onshore, which is designed by Americans themselves. Why you complain about it?
Well, to start with, there is one major error. For the past 10 years, foreigners have been buying less U.S. Treasury securities, not more. There's a net reduction in the holdings of treasuries by foreign official institutions. The entirety of the American trade deficit has been financed by selling stocks, equities, like tech stocks to foreigners, not debt. So we now have a situation where the United States has a very large internal budget deficit. It's over 6% of GDP. That's a great deal for the United States, and it's extraordinarily high for an economic expansion when tax revenues are supposed to rise. Uh, we have very high interest rates and very high real interest rates in the United States. And our studies have shown that the U.S. interest rates are nearly a percentage point higher, real interest rates, than they would be because of the lack of foreign official buying of U.S. treasuries. Now, this is not simply an economic issue. After the West seized $300 billion of Russian reserves, many central banks started reducing their exposure to the United States because if we're going to be running around seizing people's reserves after they've lent money to us, we don't look like a very good risk. So
Yeah, yeah.
this is beginning to hurt the United States. It's becoming, and it could be a very serious issue for us.
No, David, we know the problem. That is, the United States running high and high, unsustainable debt, and the U.S. manufacturer being hollowing out. But my question is this: will the high tariff provide a solution to all of this? Because there is a structural issue. You want to maintain the hegemony of U.S. dollars all over the world. So if you want to do that, of course, your manufacturer will go out, so-called manufacture off-law and private onshore on-law. For example, in 1971, when U.S. dollar established U.S. dollar hegemony there, then the manufacture in U.S. GDP is about 23.5%, right? By 1991, when Soviet Union collapsed, only 14.5% left. When Donald Trump came to power in 2017, it's still about 11.2 about the total GDP, manufacturing total US GDP. After Donald Trump first term and Joe Biden, now it's about 10.2. Looks like after two presidents from two different directions want to revitalize American manufacturers. American manufacturers continuously to decline. So the question is that which one you want? You cannot have both.
I agree with you, and my view is that tariffs are not sufficient to restore American manufacturing. I think we
Yeah.
need changes in the tax system. We need intensive education for skilled workers. We need more federal support for research and development. Relative to the size of economy, federal support for R&D is now half of what it was during the Reagan years and a fraction of what it was during the Kennedy moonshot period. We need a number of different things. Um, Tariffs, I think, are most effective for particular industries. So, for example, I very strongly support high tariffs on uh, electric vehicles because China now can produce electric vehicles much more efficiently than we can. And if we opened up imports, we'd have no auto industry left. So we need to protect the auto industry as a strategic resource. Donald Trump has proposed that we invite Chinese companies to build plants in the United States, which I think is a
So
very good idea.
So high tariff is just a leverage to force Chinese, like what the Japanese did in 1980s, 1990s, to come to United States to build up manufacturers there. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that it's very similar to what Reagan proposed with the Japanese, and that worked very well because after the Japanese built plants in the United States, the American auto companies learned how to be more efficient. And I believe that from what I
Then that's a
know,
good thing in that way that, but we do say that the Biden administration right now try to sanction against all those Chinese companies. He just put 140 some companies on the
yes,
list, want the strategic decoupling. What you said, you want Chinese manufacturers, of course, going back to the United States, build up factories over there, which. It looks
no,
like Donald Trump does not want to decouple with China.
yes, I think Donald Trump ultimately wants a deal with China. Um, I've never believed that technology sanctions would have very much effect. In fact, I think
I
they
agree.
make
Yeah.
the opposite
Yeah.
effect. I noticed, for example, that SMIC, which is China's biggest chip company, has seen its stock price double in the past 2 months.
Yeah, because sales goes up.
That's because we've given Chinese companies 100% control of the world's largest market for chips and kept our companies out of it. That I think is stupid. That's not going to work. Uh, we need more than tariffs. But I think tariffs are important, particularly for selected industries. Sometimes you have a strategic industry, you simply have to protect it. We can't allow the American auto industry to disappear, even if it means some economic inefficiencies. So uh, I, I am not sure how Trump's economic team is going to apply tariffs. There are many conflicting reports about this, and I know there are many conflicting views. So I will wait to see what the actual plan is before I comment on it. But yes, I think there are many things we need to do besides tariffs.
So he just used high tariffs as a campaign instrument, or he just use it as a bargaining chip to get what he wants from China and the other part of the world, so that
I
we can
think,
all help the United States to revitalize the manufacturing.
remember, it's very difficult to have complex economic arguments during a political campaign. And when Donald Trump
Yeah.
emphasized tariffs during the campaign, his message was, I want to restore American manufacturing, which is the right message. Now, the details of how to do that are more complicated than simply putting on tariffs.
Yeah.
And I think his
But
economic team knows that.
But still, like some people argue that if Donald Trump really want to put a high tariff on China and the other major manufacturer power, then the inflation will continue and will do Americans no good. But this brings
That,
me to another issue that
that,
is, you know, because we have to move on, David. Sorry, I
yes.
apologize for that.
No, no.
And Donald Trump's major, flag is MAGA, Make America Great Again. Like we said, is a fundamental change of U.S. policy and the political momentum from the left-wing liberalism back to right-wing conservatism in that regard. So, what will this do? What's the impact will be on U.S. democracy or Americanism? Because we heard a lot of argument. Sometimes this argument very strong and very emotional. Said Donald Trump will undo U.S. Democracy, will undo Americanism, and so to what extent Donald Trump's mega movement will bring to United States, which is a number one power on earth and which has always claimed to be the most advanced democracy, for all of this. So what this Donald Trump mega will bring to the United States?
The entire political establishment was against him. All the major media were against him. Most of the major corporations were against him, with a couple of exceptions like Elon Musk. The whole of the political establishment hated Trump. And the media that Trump employed was a popular media. X, for example, which is, of course, owned by Elon Musk, became an open forum. And as Elon Musk said, every citizen can be a journalist. So it was the netizens, it was a grassroots surge that supported Trump when every major newspaper, every major television station was attacking him. So, and he won not only the electoral college vote, but the popular vote. And he won critical constituencies. For example, a majority of Hispanic men voted for Trump. A lot of the minorities in the United States voted for him. So it was a very broad-based election. So no, I would call the Trump movement a triumph of American democracy against elitist top-down policy control.
So in that regard, we know that Donald Trump especially targeted the establishment, especially deep state. And so first, to the people outside the United States, even in the United States, what deep state really means, and why Donald Trump want to launch such an assault against deep state. Does he really mean it? And what the consequences will be?
The most extreme example of the deep state is the letter signed by 50 American intelligence officials in 2020, claiming that the story about Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian disinformation campaign. Now, we know the story was true, but we had several former directors of the CIA and National Security Agency, top intelligence officials, swearing that this was a Russian disinformation operation. We know they were lying. And on the strength of that letter, the entire media suppressed the story. Facebook and Twitter, before Musk owned it, refused to link to the story. It was published by a major newspaper, the New York Post, but no one knew about it because it was completely suppressed with the intervention of the intelligence community. Now, that is a threat
almost
to
every
democracy.
one of us.
That's the deep
America.
state.
Yeah.
Yes. So when Trump talks about, and Vice President Vance made a very big point about this in a number of media interviews, this is a threat to democracy coming from the intelligence community abusing their special trust and their special access to information to prevent facts from getting to the American public. If that story had gone out, I think Trump would have been reelected in 2020. That would have turned the election.
So in that regard, there's a deluge. There is a kind of just mentioned a phenomenon in the past a couple of days. Since there is about speculation that TikTok will be banned, the so-called TikTok refugees come to this red knots, we call it 小红书 in China. The deluge of them come in. Do you think this is a reaction to what you said, that is Americans are fed up? Ordinary Americans fed up with this kind of control and so on and so forth?
I don't think the TikTok issue has anything to do with the deep state. Remember, America has been used to being the dominant superpower, particularly after 1990. We were the only superpower after 1990. The rise of China as an economic and eventually military superpower is a shock to the United States. We have not come to terms with it. So America and American leaders are looking for any action they can take to limit China's power. And I believe that's what motivates the proposal to ban TikTok. Now, whether this is an effective way of limiting China's power is a different issue. I'm an American. I want my country to be the strongest. But I don't think that banning TikTok will necessarily accomplish that objective. But I think that's the motivation.
How do you explain this kind of people coming from, they call themselves the TikTok refugee, they get another Chinese app. It's registered headquartered in China.
Well, I
It's a
think
kind of hoopla right now. What's
yes,
that has to do with what you
I,
said? You think people are fed up with kind of intelligence forces watching over their shoulders? They use their actions to show their kind of
no,
the kind of
I don't believe these things are related at all. People who don't like the establishment media can
uh-huh.
generally go to X, to Twitter, which is now the public square of the United States. So
Yep.
everyone I know, everyone involved in policy discussions is on X, including me.
Okay.
TikTok is more specialized for young people. It's been a very important forum for the European patriotic parties, which have reached out to young people via TikTok. Um, but I think these are unrelated issues.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit more controversial, sharp question here. We know that Jim Mattis is a mad dog who used to be Donald Trump's defense secretary in the first term. In his letter he published in July 2020, I believe, he said Donald Trump is a president for division, not for unity. Given the fact we know that the United States as a nation is deeply divided, the division is so deep that it seems irreconcilable. So when Donald Trump come to power, will he be able to overcome this division, or he make United States more divisive and more conflict-ridden? Because division means conflict, you know. So it looks like the people who love Donald Trump, the people who hate him, are equally emotionally strong.
No,
And this is phenomena. Do you think Donald Trump can bring all the Americans together, or he
I,
will really become a president of division, like Jim Mattis said?
I am optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
The historic division in the United States, the tragic one, is racial because of slavery and its legacy. And Donald Trump has appealed to minorities, to African Americans and Hispanic Americans more effectively than any Republican president since really Richard Nixon. So I think his populist outreach to minorities has been very effective. And to the extent he can continue that, he will help to heal the most dangerous and harmful division in American society. There are other divisions, for example, ideological divisions between liberal and conservative, which he will intensify. But the really dangerous division is the racial division, and I think he's made a great deal of progress towards improving that.
Yep. But still, I just want the questions in front of us to discuss this, because it looks like to me that the division will continue, especially when Donald Trump's economic and financial policy seems to be problematic to me at least. For example, we see when Donald Trump comes to power in next 4 or 5 days, we have three highs. Number one, high tariff. Number two, high budget deficit, which has to be because if you want to lower the interest or lower the taxes, as he promised, you have to increase the budget deficit to make the ends meet. And then he want continue this so-called quantitative easing, that is a high supply of American dollars to the market, which all direct to one direction, that is inflation. So how can you handle that? A very important reason for Donald Trump to win this election is because American people are had enough with inflation. They don't want to suffer. And
I think
do you think that inflation is avoidable, or if it comes, in my view, it will come? How are you going to manage it? I mean, how Donald Trump administration is going to manage it? This.
I, I think you're pointing to very real risks. I've written about these issues in Asia Times, and I
Yeah.
agree that the budget deficit is a significant issue, particularly because financing the budget deficit has mainly come from domestic American banks, and that could eventually be inflationary, and cutting taxes would add to the deficit. The risk is that interest rates will go up, inflation will go up, and of course, tariffs could also lead to more inflation because they're a tax. They raise the price of imported goods. So yes, these are dangers. what could mitigate these dangers? Well, for example, Trump's drill, baby, drill approach. There are many regulatory changes
Yep.
which could increase the efficiency of American industry. So if we take energy, which is probably the single most important input in inflation, if regulatory changes increase the supply of energy in the United States and reduce its price, that's an important mitigating effect. Now, that's not the only mitigating effect. Let's say, for example, we invite Chinese companies, BYD or SAIC, to build EV plants in the United States, and Americans get the same kind of deflation in manufactured goods prices that Chinese are enjoying. Cars are cheaper in China thanks to more productive factories.
But that's
That
exactly what the Americans, at least for now, the Biden administration want to prevent. They leave
well, that's right.
100% the taxes on Chinese EVs. They want to ban Chinese EVs to American market. And Donald Trump will want to restore the energy products. He doesn't want the EV. And you're talking about BYD can go to United States, which
Well,
is
no,
quite confusing here.
if if Chinese companies build plants in the United States and make
Mhm.
EVs in the United States, Trump has said he'll support that, and that could
Okay.
also reduce the price of autos, for example. There are many things that can be done to improve productivity. Energy is the obvious one, but that can also be true in manufacturing, which can reduce prices. So the question is, which of these tendencies will prevail? I think that restoring American manufacturing is a difficult problem which requires many different approaches. And I'm waiting to see what the Trump administration comes up with. I've written a good deal about what I think should be done, but I'm not in the administration.
Yeah,
Uh,
because historically, if we remember in 1980s, 1990s, when Hitler is in charge of trade, he used exactly the same tactic you mentioned to threaten the Japanese with high tariffs, and then to force the Japanese automobile manufacturers, Toyota, Mazda, Nissan, come in United States with their own money, with their own technology, with their own supply chain, working with GM, with Ford, with Chrysler, and revitalized the entire automobile industry in the United States. Do you
yes,
think that Donald Trump won't do the same to the Chinese EV factories? That is,
he has
bring your own
he
money, bring your own technology, bring your supply chain, come to the United States, build up factories here. Do you
he
think
has
that's doable, or that's what his plan really is?
uh, of course it's doable, um, and he's proposed exactly that. Whether it will happen, I do not know.
He
I have
proposed
not
that.
heard what.
When and where did he propose that?
Well, he started in April of last year in a speech in Youngstown, Ohio,
Uh-huh.
and he's repeated that several times since. Let me ask you, do you think that Chinese EV companies would like to build plants in the United
Of
States?
course, if that can help them to make a profit, I think Chinese EV company goes follows the market economy, and they want to make money. They go if in good terms, and of course. But here, what we heard all the year for is that United States want decoupling with China, want to prevent the Chinese EV industry go to the United States. That's exactly what Biden administration is doing. And also we heard some hawkish people in Donald Trump's camp said they don't want that. They want
Uh,
zero
I think
Chinese EV in the United
there are
States.
many views in the Trump camp,
Yep.
but Trump himself has proposed to invite the Chinese companies to build EV plants in the United States. I think that would be an excellent thing to do. And I applaud him for opening that. And what it shows you is that Trump doesn't hate China. He hates trade deficits. There are many Americans who hate China. Trump is not a hater. He wants a tough deal with China that benefits Americans. But China ultimately, Trump ultimately doesn't care what other people do in their countries. He cares about what happens to the United States and to Americans. That's
Okay,
America
this
first, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I heard you. I heard you. I think the audience here in China would love to hear what you said, and we really hope that since we go that direction, this leads us to the last piece of a discussion, that is U.S.-China relations. Overall, where do you see this bilateral relations will go?
Well,
Which direction?
um, the appointments that Trump has made on the defense and national security side point towards a stabilization of relations. So, for example, um, uh, Elbridge Colby, who is the Undersecretary for Policy at Defense, has said many times that he is a realist and he wants to maintain the status quo regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea. Uh, I think that's uh, the right policy for the United States. The best thing that can happen from our standpoint is nothing at all. Under the Biden administration, we had the provocation of Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, which China took very seriously, and in fact was a provocation. It was something that the Biden administration should not have done. What I hear from most of the key people who Trump has put in is a much more realistic attitude to avoid conflict. And I think the best that we can do for the time being is maintain the status quo and avoid provocations on both sides, which would be harmful to everybody. So I'm
Yep.
cautiously optimistic that the military balance will remain stable and calm between the US and China.
So you are predicting a kind of stable, at least manageable bilateral relations in terms of security or peace. But here we know that since Donald Trump's first term, and then of course very much strengthened by Biden administration is the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, which is Quad. That is United States, Japan, Australia, and the India working together to get to China, to hold China, this Indo-Pacific strategy.
Yes,
And
but
also the AUKUS, United States, British, and Australians coming together, and also another trilateral relationship, alliance, Japanese, Koreans, and United States. All of this, of course, obviously to get to China. To what
yes,
extent do
well,
you say
a
these
lot has
policies
changed.
will continue under Donald Trump's administration?
Well, yes, of course. The Trump administration will not officially dissolve AUKUS or anything like that, but it's also the case that a great deal has changed. India maintained its friendship with Russia during the Ukraine war and became Russia's biggest customer for its
Yeah.
oil. The Biden administration was very angry about this and I think U.S. relations with India have deteriorated a great deal. So India, meanwhile, has improved relations with China by reducing tensions on the border, and there may be some economic opening as well. So I don't think India is not an American pawn. India pursues its own interests in whatever way it desires. So, of course, people in Washington will talk about developing alliances to contain China, but the fact is, um, thanks to the stupidity of the Biden administration, America's influence in Asia has declined.
So I agree with you. I think maybe Donald Trump's China policy is not really uh, to keep uh, it is to keep U.S. hegemony or dominance in the region or balance in the region, but he doesn't want to spoil the party. He wants to maintain a kind of stability between the two major powers. I think that's a good news. I think that's what China also want.
But
But we do have some issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, North Korea, another example, and he tried. So
well,
if
yes.
if if I understand you right, you say Donald Trump want to maintain the kind of status quo stability here, will not be so aggressive as the previous administration vis-a-vis China, in that regard. Did I get you right?
I think that's correct. Based on the repeated public statements of many officials who were in senior positions in the administration and Trump's own statements, I think that the United States will try to maintain status quo and avoid conflicts. I
Yeah,
think
but
that you can expect lots of rhetoric from the administration
reality is
about
still
human
reality.
rights and so forth, but that's rhetoric. That doesn't have strategic weight.
Yeah, the last the issue we want to talk about is coming back to Europe. We know that there is a very strange triangle between Europe, United States, and China, especially the Ukraine war. And given the increasing, in my view, political fragmentation in Europe and the economic slowdown, and also given the fact that the U.S.-Europe alliance has been a major strength of the United States. But when Donald Trump's come to power, it looks like Europe, like you said, may have more so-called, may have to go to the direction of so-called strategic autonomy or strategic independence. In that regard, what kind of role you think Europe can still play in the bilateral relationship between United States and China? It's a balancing power. It's a more kind of power that opportunistic. Which way you see that Europe can go between the two superpowers?
I think Europe will maintain its relationship with the United States, and that will be a principal relationship. But I think that the nature of NATO has to change and will change. In other words, instead of being uh, effectively an American-dominated alliance, it will be much more of a partnership among equals. And a good example of how that may develop with respect to China is Hungary. I'm talking to you from Budapest now. Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, has excellent relations with Donald Trump. Trump has praised him on public occasions many times. They talk frequently. Orban is a trusted advisor to Trump, but Orban also has very good economic relations with China. Hungary is, in fact, the largest destination for Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe. So I think Hungary has set an example of how you can have strong economic and trade relations with China, but still maintain a principled strategic relationship with the United States. I think these are achievable things, and Hungary has set a very good example.
Yeah, because we know that the previous administration, the Biden administration, tried everything possible to pull Europe on their side and try to prevent a kind of improvement economically or politically between Europe and China. That's why it takes this term called de-risking, which is a German term. German invented this. But
No,
so from your side, you think that Donald Trump will not be against any improvement of relationship between Europe and China, especially we're not against the kind of promotion of economic exchanges between Europe and China. You think that will work for Donald Trump's interests?
I
I'm a
do.
little bit puzzled by this.
I do not know what the thinking is about Europe and China and Donald Trump's team. That hasn't been a priority, and I think some of the key appointments have not been made yet. Uh, but what has happened because of the mistakes of the Biden administration is that German economic relations with China have become much more intense. German foreign direct investment in China is now at an all-time high. Many
Yeah.
German companies are shutting down factories in Germany and building them in China, or even disassembling factories in Germany and shipping them to China because the cost of energy in Germany is 5 times as high as the cost of energy in China, thanks to
Yeah,
the
due to
Ukraine
the
war
war.
and the lack of
Yeah.
Russian gas. So, to the extent that Biden wanted to keep Germany away from China, his mistakes had the exact opposite effect.
Yeah, I have to let you go. I know 2 times, but I have one more question. I think it's very important. That is, as a human being, we're facing some common challenges like financial stability, which is very much undermined by some people's argument because Donald Trump's policy. Another is nuclear arms control, proliferation issue, and the global environmental issue, and also public health. To what extent you think that Donald Trump administration would be willing to go together with Chinese, Europeans, and other parts of the world to come together to overcome those challenges. Right now, it looks like Donald Trump doesn't want to be part of it. He wants to be American first. He doesn't have nothing to do with the environmental issue, nothing to do with public health issue. He wants to withdraw from all those WTO, WHO, and so on and so forth. But we do need Americans to play a part in it. So how do you see the
I think
future
you've
in all
answered your own
those?
question. I think the Trump administration's focus will be on America and its own needs and not on international cooperation for the time being.
But that is not a good news because the United States is deeply, deeply integrated with this world. And that's the strongest country on earth. America need to, and in my view, should play a role in all of this. So if the United States withdraw from all those efforts, it's only going to isolate Americans further from this village we call the world.
The question, I think it's a good question to ask whether the kind of initiatives we've had through international organizations are the most effective way to address these issues. For example, the Paris Agreement on carbon emissions, which the United States presumably will withdraw from. I think we need a different kind of international system, and it will take some improvisation and trial and error to get to that.
But it takes the entire village to deal with the issues we just mentioned, either the nuclear arms control or the environment, public health, financial stability. And I do not believe it will work for America's own interest if the United States decided, say, we don't want to get along with you guys. We don't want to take care of those things. That's your problem. That's not mine. I think, frankly, I don't see any good sense coming out of this kind of attitude and approach.
Well, it depends. For example, the international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so forth, which are the single most powerful international organizations, have done a very bad job, particularly in Africa. They've tended to they've recommended economic policies often which inhibit development rather than promote it. And I think Africa has done much better in its bilateral relationship with China than it has from the IMF, for example. So there are many cases where bilateral improvisation may do better than the existing international organizations. You have to look at it case by case.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, David.
非常感谢大家收看今天的直播啊！特朗普政府究竟会交出一份怎样的答卷啊？这个时间呢也已经很近了，相信呢我们很快就会得到答案。那么今天再见，我们下次再见。